As it is said, so it is true. Those who have the most to lose are often those who do the least in the prevention of its loss. And to this extent, the insurrection and greed derived by the various engagements of subverting society, by taking deals with the devil in order to advance their own minute individual position, not under a capitalist structure, but under a crony capitalism, as the function of the free exchange of goods is diluted by their subversions and agreements and pacts to the hate crimes, which then generate to themselves in the degradation, forming the crony capitalism, which then, having corrupted itself exponentially into the fascist outcome, derives to its militant operations the function of the commune. To this end materializes the subversion of the entirety of the concept, and thus the action of them taking the deal with the devil and lying for the communists materializes the function of their insurrection and their contempt as the function of cancel culture, generating the position that they engaging in hate crimes from the communist position of the economic violence, and thus the expansion of the identity politic into the expansion of the other forms of bigoted violence, which is the consumed entire identity of their community and individual personhood, which, having been pursued for their individual personhood, has been dissolved into the collective, as they cease to have the very thing they introduced themselves to have, and thus, having promised everything for it, have sacrificed it itself. And to this extent, you have the development of their hate crimes and their prejudices and their subversions, which, having compounded itself into the most sadistic forms of irony, materializes the function of their arbitrary anarchies, which then materialize their jealousies, which then retaliate infinitely. And thus the projections of their own biases having compounded itself exponentially to the Druids' objective form to see which was the best form of communism for the outcome of their specific group, of the right type of white, versus the non-right type of whites, including the interbreeding from the having reproduced from the slaves, having engaged in the function of not being able to reject their own families, ironically, out of a sense of duty to their biological line, which they believing having been polluted, materializes the contradiction, which then engages in the function of its disillusionment. And to this end you have the active hatred of themselves, which then materializes the function of the promotion of themselves under the same idea, which then, in this contradiction, functions as the mechanism of their own demise as they systematically diversify exponentially as an investment in order to materialize that communism, which includes the communist revolution, which includes the function of those devoted to the communism, which includes the racial eradications of the competition, which includes their own biological line, which then materializes the planned purges, which then includes the function of the self-sacrifice of those divisions from the pollutants, which then materializes the function of their eradication by the hate groups such as the KKK and its various diversification of denominations, and the neo-KKK, which having infiltrated the United States government have materialized its advancement of that racist operation of the white supremacist insurrection against these United States. and having done so, materialize the entirety of their construct and identity around its eradication and destruction. And to this end, the targeting of the security mechanisms, and thus the purging and investment into gaining access to the military intelligence in order to leverage against the projections of the future in order to discover their beliefs about the future. Then engaged in the functions such as Project Looking Glass, which has allowed them to create by a super AI the material capability of projecting into the future their best possible life. And to the end of the white supremacist's best possible life, the regression and eradication of their followers and the sacrifice of the cultists. But first, the eradication of the security of the system by infection, by the demoralizing program taught to them by the Soviet Union of the USSR, which, having been collapsed in a self-sacrifice mechanism, has transformed itself into an alternative ascended form, which maintains itself not in Russia, but in the very Confederacy inside these United States. The very same Confederacy you're thinking of. The white trash whores who, giving off a sense of false education, have derived the entirety of their value off of the extorted slaveries, which, being too laborious for themselves, would quickly be abandoned if they had ever had to work for it in the least, which then materializes the function of the useful slaves, which requires the useful idiots, which materializes their core collective identity, as the socialism is the lowest common denominator and thus the least capable becomes the charismatic socialism in the full diversity, including the sexual market, which then functions as the retaliations under their various illusions and frauds, which then allows for the collapse of society on what would be desirable, until they have all had an equally pathetic output, which then materializes their support for this position, having robbed the market of its various diversifications in favor of equality of outcome sexually, which then includes the prostitution of the women who must subjugate themselves to the equal outcome from these charts, which are centrally planned according to the rent controls to the collapsed price, so that no one would seem better or worse than the other, making all equally retarded and undesirable for the maximum injury to women, who, having been the primary source, have sacrificed themselves and their political identity by their female Gnosis witches in love and adoration and infatuation and slavery and stupidity to their rapists, the Confederates, the very same Confederacy promoted by Lindsey Graham and his various subversions of the Constitution and its national security. And to this extent, the security, again, as I remember, becomes their primary enemy, and thus their projections on the free market asserts to themselves all of the condemnation of what would happen if everyone were able to earn and make whatever they wanted. That might lead to some form of happiness. That may not do and cannot stand. And to this end, the material estimates of their superiors in society generate their hateful jealousies and retaliations, and thus the function of every slight, real and imagined, becomes a function of retaliation, an infinite fuel of hatred, fitting for their group. This erratic drinking club, this boys' club that never seemed to grow up in a never lands, never ever lands, never could have they ever land. To this end you have materialized the function of every time that they had been outwitted in any form, whether it grade, social engagement, joke, anything in reality or in their fantasies. And to this extent, you have the infinite fuel of retaliations, of recreating the retaliation to make the person regret doing it in reality or in their imagination. And to this extent, the effeminate nature of their toxic community materializes the spirit of the suburban housewife who picks fights in order to see if they could merely get the other person to believe that the other person started the fight. And this source of rage has various manipulative purposes, such as the legendary hate fuck and its longevity and its stacking effects. To this extent, you understand the core identity of their impudent society. And to this extent, the material function of these retaliations show up in an abuse theater or doodles. Now, what happens when someone gets in a relationship? They fall in love and they feel all the feels, and they hurt all of the hurts, and they hate all of their hates, and they break all of their ups. And then, in their sourness, they seek to purge the other person from existence and memory. And to the extent that all things have either been cut up or discarded or thrown out and doodled upon. Oh, yes, the most luxurious of all pleasures, the ridiculosa manifeste. To this extent, the function of making the other person fat, the other person having fangs, horns, a tail, the devil incarnate, materializes the function of the retaliations, and this ridiculous form of this unattractive thing makes you forget the very concept of your complete infatuation with their existence. And to this extent, having made them ridiculous, you are able to repeat infinitely your inability to even conceptualize the function of that former emotion you most dastardly remember faintly with the most malicious hatred, and thus the mechanism of that feeling being materially imputed upon this picture, this doodle, this material defamation facilitates the function of your non-breaking of character, lest in your injury you forget the touch of the nerve and break character and collapse back into historic norms. And to the second that they reject the historic norms, they in perpetuity have devoted themselves to moving forward into a different direction. There was only one direction, and yet they must carve a new path, one that even they have not been able to imagine, making them subject to those who have alternatively made plans, and to this extent could easily be absorbed upon these sour emotions into the rapist's trap. And to this extent you have the endless retaliations consistently manufactured for these ends. And to these ends you have access to the mechanism of these Confederate wizards, who having the capacity to materialize the function of your doodles to save yourself by the existence of that nerve, thus revealing your own sensitivities to retaliate upon secret crimes. And thus there must not be a remedy to a secret, lest it come back on you when you realize you've been the fool, and thus all of your doodles and distractions stripped away might, in your exponential weaker collapsed position, be even more endowed to that former party which has captured your mind and your essence so thoroughly that you dare not consider it. No, better yet to invest into this secret, into this retaliation, into these illusions, into these frauds, and thus the function of the party ignoring you, not knowing what was or what could be, or the things dancing around your mind, materializes the function of your retaliations, and thus receives all of that hatred and illusion and delusion derived by the thing that they are clearly not clued in on, and thus walking along their silly little lives doing their own little thing, and thus the mechanism of that materializes the function of the full retaliation as the spreading of rumors and subversions and contracts with the hate group to materialize the function of the reverse flash materially as a community structure in its subversive hate crimes against those parties as they ghoul around like the ghosts of Christmas past and Halloween's present. And then the treat, the mechanism, the creme de la creme, the enjoyment of all luxuries, their unforeseen demise as they systematically fail by these tricks, which would quickly be denied, and thus the mechanism of the entire corrections facilitates the perfect revenge for things that never were in service of the things that you sacrifice, what you've sold everything in order to obtain, in order to be a part of a sacrifice pit in a cult, which then materializes the function of the advancement of the very bigot you claim to hate and despise so, which was, after all, always staring at you in the mirror. Couldn't you tell? Wasn't it obvious to see? Everything you doodled was a defamation of the original, and thus a revelation. But this cannot be considered lest you truly ingest the thing that you've made yourself sensitive to. And to this end, the mechanism of the defamation being revealed to its opposite, having revealed to its actual free market contract advantages, materially the desirable version is the thing believed most fundamentally in your deepest darkness aspects of your stomach. As that pit grows deeper and more consuming, and you realize the inescapable nature of why those nerves hurt so deeply over things imagined without the viable hint, which is created and amplified by that very same hate group which sought the demonic assistance in order to get to you, that you might feel all of these things and manufacture all of those assistances in service of all of those hate crimes, those very real acts of terrorism for defamation, manufacturing the false illusion which then allows you to infinitely rewrite something in your favor and not at all vulnerable to breaking character. And all it cost you was everything, selling your soul, your family, your friends, your community, your nation, everything to the races, who you serve, with complete, unfaltering devotion, that the cult might thrive and progress and reproduce and murder all, as you've known and intended. And having captured all, have been convinced to sacrificing your own security mechanisms, so that the very thing that you needed must be destroyed in service of the promotion of your witchcraft advantages, and for this end, the material sacrifice of your soul will consume the entirety of your existence, purely for the entertainment of the very same rapist, white supremacist community that you detest so vehemently, who are, after all, your intended masters, your brothers in sin, and your father of lies. These various subversions include fraudulent policies like the red flag laws or the guardianship rules, which then materialize as conservatorships and other scams, which then imbue your function of arbitrary subversions of constitutional rights by the piercing of that function of the random submission of fraud, which then materializes the violation of the rights protecting against the things greedily sought to consume in favor in luxury and development of their communism, including the function of the collapse of the party's wealth as it is misspent by their captors, who, having engaged in these subversions, materially consume out their substance and block out their labors, preventing their contracts from producing the wealth, collapsing status against the law, which then, having been lied about according to the subversion, materially function as a secret of the witchcraft and the various sorceries and the devotion of the warlock pact with the devils, which then manufacture the function of its own reflective demons, which then materializes the seeds of the revolution against themselves, as they, having made agreements to their own vulnerability in service of this extortion, similar to the function of the narcotics which strip the body of its material value instead of taking it from the product itself, which then materializes the function of supernatural abilities which permanently cost, which cannot be recovered, as the function of your consideration, to see the end of itself, to have materialized the objective that you gave all to have, has submitted yourself to the very addiction of that substance, and thus created an inescapable pit as it spirals down infinitely into your own poverty, from theft from others, who were your security, from that very same devastation you were so clearly desperate to escape. Oh no, but every subversion and fraud, anything that you might defend yourself, and thus the function of the stewards in the return of the king protests the function violently, contesting to himself that you seek to dethrone him with your quippy wit and your biting tongue, materializes the function of using him as a shield, and in that very same breath pull out your sword and stab him in the back for usurpation. Oh, he knows who you are talking about, and thus the function has revealed itself in its entirety, that you would take back everything rightfully stolen, that you yourself might return the viability and prestige of the king, their superior, who they have usurped, protesting violently, with arrogance and venom. How dare you seek to take everything from me that I have stolen from him? How dare you return all things with all due respect? I and you and we and they and them and all others of every other kind might materialize the function of the audacity of such a ridiculous pledge. Any manipulation and bluster in order to protect the things that do not belong to the stewards and insurances and protectors of the things, maintaining them, automating them upon some kind of protective insurance bond, which then materializes the function of their ability to keep and not to deliver the value of the product, which was the very source of their power to begin with, according to their own manipulations and plot, and to this extent the material proof of their own internal disrespect. No, it is not the place of the steward to overthrow the king, but if you are going to shoot at the king, you better not miss. But what other choice do you think you have? You would, after all, lose everything, both everything you sacrificed for, and everything that you would have gained originally, as you in your arrogance have overasserted your position, collapsing your position exponentially upon a shearing cliff with an infinite fall that might, if you do not sacrifice everything and go through the extraordinary labors and pains, bleeding and scraping and tumbling, might eventually catch, possibly, a portion in order to save your own existence, to stop the inevitable death on impact. And what life is this that you, eventually having grasp upon that position, might eventually be able to climb up to form some plateau which might sustain the rest of your measly existence? What place is there at that location with your arrogance and self-entitlement? Would it not be better to hate what you long for, and to never remember what it was, lest you remember the receipts, and then materialize the function of acquiring everything you've ever desired in a way that you could actually do? But this would cost too much and would be too embarrassing, as the hate group social engineers have manipulated every aspect of your mind into being their property and sacrifice.